Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a supplemental lecture video of a topic that I found very, very interesting called the four villains of listening. This man right here, Oscar Trimboli, he's one of the world's leading experts on deep listening. And in his podcast, he identified four different types of listening villains. These are styles of listening that often detract from rapport, that can ruin the rhythm, and that really don't represent true listening. So let's get into it. If you want to address these topics any further, I would highly recommend Oscar's award winning podcast called Deep Listening Impact Beyond Words. This is where I've got these ideas about the four villains of listening. So, if you want a deeper explanation, I would highly recommend his podcast or his YouTube channel. So, the first listening villain that we encounter is the dramatic listener. The dramatic listener loves drama, loves to ask small questions to dig into the emotion and to dig into the details of what someone else is saying. Now, on the surface, this sounds great. You want to find the underlying emotion and you want to ask those questions to the speaker. However, what the dramatic listener does without even thinking about it is hijack the conversation. It makes the conversation not about what the speaker is saying, but what the dramatic listener is focused on in terms of narrative and in terms of the emotions of what's going on. It's a very common trap for the dramatic listener to want to insert their own story that might be relevant to what the speaker is saying, but what the dramatic listener is really doing is taking the conversation and switching it over to speak in their own terms, not to truly listen to the speaker and interact with them on their terms. Trimboli has some more ways to define this on his podcast.
There's another story I love, and it comes from one of my clients. I call it the funeral story. Now, my client, she went to her boss when her grandmother had passed away and wanted some time off for the funeral. She asked her manager this question on a Monday and the funeral was on a Wednesday. So she basically said to her boss, "Can I have some time off for the funeral?" And by the time she'd finished saying the word funeral and grandmother, her boss spent the next 10 minutes explaining how difficult it was when her grandmother passed away and how troublesome the funeral was and how difficult the probate on the will was. And by the time she'd finished, my client simply said, "Is it okay if I go to the funeral on Wednesday?"
Trimboli also goes on to give some tips to help the dramatic listener hopefully be a better conversationalist.
So here's some key themes to think about if you think you might be the dramatic listener. Do you make it all about them or do you make it all about you? Do you make them feel unimportant? Do you listen really intent for drama or conflict?
In addition to the dramatic listener, we have the interrupting listener. The interrupting listener is often characterized by impatience. They do not have the time or the presence to really sit through what someone is trying to say, or they think the speaker is speaking too slowly. So they like to interrupt and finish the other person's sentences and try to insert questions or their own thoughts because they just don't have the patience to truly sit down and then listen to what another person's trying to say. This also includes the pauses and the silence. An interrupting listener will often be very quick to interrupt a silence. But sometimes, as Oscar says many times, silence should be treated as another word. So here's more about what Trimboli has to say on the interrupting listener.
They're like the contestant on a TV game show that buzzes early before the host has been able to explain the question fully and all they do is they answer the wrong question. The interrupting listener feels like you're speaking way too slowly. You're describing the issue so elongated. They want to just get to the answer as quickly as possible. So their intent in listening is really listening to solve. It's listening to fix rather than to be listening from curiosity.
He also gives some very sound advice on what interrupting listeners can do to improve their conversational listening.
So here's a trick in case you're an interrupting listener. If you are an interrupting listener, we want to use Nell's little technique around pause. Your little trick as the interrupting listener is just to wait all the way through the silence. Treat silence like it's another word. Listen to the beginning, the middle, and the end of silence. So you won't be jumping in and out and talking over other people. Just allow the other person to pause.